The rain had been falling since dawn, thick sheets sliding down the SUV's tinted windows. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching gray waves slam against the rocky Oregon shoreline as we wound along the coastal highway. Marielle didn't look up from her phone the entire drive. Her thumb flicked over the screen, scrolling past whatever kept her too occupied to meet my eyes. I had tried once to ask her if she remembered coming here as a child, how Warren would lift her onto his shoulders so she could see the lighthouse from the cliffs, but she only hummed without glancing away. Sterling cleared his throat as though I'd said something inconvenient. He'd always been that way around me, polite enough in public but clipped and dismissive in private, like I was a house guest overstaying my welcome. Every so often, he would check the rearview mirror and catch my gaze, and his expression never softened. Theo sat beside me, earphones in, his sneakers tapping the carpeted floor in time to a beat only he could hear. He didn't bother to pull them out when I asked if he was excited to see the ocean again. He lifted one side of the headphones just enough to mumble, "Sure," before replacing it and looking away. I turned back to the rain. The coastline blurred and reformed through the rivulets on the glass. 30 years ago, Warren and I had driven the same road, our old station wagon loaded with boxes of linens and pots and the first set of ledgers for the Rosewood Hotel. My chest tightened, remembering how full of hope we'd been, convinced our little business would mean something lasting. And it had, I suppose, just not in the way I'd imagined. We pulled off the highway, tires crunching over wet gravel, and the sign for the Rosewood emerged through the drizzle, its gold lettering shining in the gloom. I smoothed the front of my coat and exhaled, bracing myself for the next indignity I suspected was waiting behind the glass doors. We stepped into the lobby, and for a moment I almost forgot the ache in my chest. The Rosewood still smelled the way it had decades ago, a mix of polished wood, fresh flowers, and the faint sweetness of the bakery next door that always drifted in when the doors opened. Light from the brass chandeliers glowed on the marble floor I had personally chosen all those years ago. The young man behind the reception desk looked up, recognition dawning across his open, earnest face. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said to me with a nod that made something flicker in my chest, something dangerously close to feeling seen. Before I could return the greeting, Sterling stepped neatly between us. His voice snapped through the air so loud, heads turned from the sitting area. "Don't bother. That old woman is just the maid. Don't talk to her." Heat flared up my neck, a flush I couldn't control. For a second, I thought perhaps the clerk would correct him or look to me for clarity. Instead, he darted his eyes down to his keyboard and typed furiously, as if he could disappear into the screen. Marielle moved to Sterling's side, letting out a soft laugh that she tried to smother behind her hand. "She gets confused sometimes," she added, her tone syrupy with false concern. Theo tipped his chin up, studying me like I was an odd curiosity. "Grandma should just get her own room in the basement," he said, and his voice cracked with adolescent triumph. I couldn't think of a single word to say. My tongue felt heavy, clumsy. Instead, I stepped back, letting the distance grow between us as they busied themselves with credit cards and dinner reservations. No one looked in my direction again, not even the clerk, who now spoke only to Sterling and Marielle, never lifting his eyes past their shoulders. But I stood there feeling every stare from the other guests, all of them surely wondering why an old woman would hover so uselessly at the edge of her own story. I knew then that tonight I would sit alone while they laughed behind closed doors, and that tomorrow morning would bring nothing better. They didn't ask if I wanted to join them for dinner. I knew better than to expect it. Instead, after Sterling signed the papers and collected the brass room keys, Marielle handed me a folded slip with my own room number scribbled across the top. She didn't meet my eyes. Her hand was trembling, though whether from shame or impatience I couldn't say. I carried my small suitcase along the hallway by myself. No bellhop offered to help. No one stopped me to ask if I needed anything. I suppose when people believe you're nothing, they make certain you feel it every step of the way. My room was on the first floor, tucked behind the kitchen storage corridor. I'd reserved it dozens of times in years past for traveling sales reps who didn't care about the view. The brass number on the door was the same one Warren had hung there with his own hands. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it slowly, pressing my palm to the door before I opened it, as if bracing for the quiet. Inside, everything looked just as I remembered. The plain bedspread, the small writing desk, the cheap clock ticking too loudly against the hush. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the mattress. My knees ached from standing so long in the lobby. I rubbed them absently, but the ache behind my breastbone didn't ease. Through the thin wall, I could hear the muffled clatter of plates and the rise and fall of voices from the restaurant. Somewhere out there, Marielle and Sterling were drinking wine and telling stories that never included me. I stared at the pale wallpaper and tried to remember the last time my daughter had looked at me with something other than weary tolerance. I pressed the heel of my hand to my chest and thought of the papers tucked in my suitcase, the ones no one had ever bothered to ask about, the ones that would remind them who I really was. I lay back on the stiff mattress and closed my eyes, letting the steady tick of the clock lull me into memory. I saw Warren as he was the day we signed the deed to this land, hair still thick and dark, his grin so wide it looked boyish. We had nothing then but a modest loan and a handful of promises we whispered to each other in the dark. Everyone thought we were foolish to risk everything on a dream as fragile as a seaside hotel. But I'd believed in it because I believed in him. I remembered those first months when we slept in the unfinished lobby on cots, waking up before dawn to scrub floors and hammer nails. I would bake muffins in a little convection oven to offer the few guests who were willing to stay somewhere so new it smelled of sawdust. Warren always said, "One day they'll come here because they've heard about the woman who made them feel at home." He was right. Over the years, people did come back season after season, and so many of them told me it was because I remembered their names. When he died, the shine dimmed. I sold off most of our other properties. It felt too heavy to carry them all alone. But I couldn't let go of Rosewood. Even when Marielle urged me to cash out and retire somewhere sunny, I refused. It wasn't about the money, though she never understood that. It was about the hours we had poured into these walls, the hundreds of quiet sacrifices no ledger could record. I opened my eyes to the thin crack in the plaster above me and felt the years stretching in every direction. Maybe I had been a coward to keep the truth to myself all this time. Or maybe it was the last piece of us I hadn't been willing to share. My hand drifted to the edge of my suitcase where the documents waited, as patient as I had been. In the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps thumping down the hallway and the muted click of Sterling's voice. I dressed carefully, smoothing my skirt, and went to meet them in the breakfast room, though I knew already how it would feel. Marielle didn't look up when I sat down at the end of the table. She was tapping out an email on her phone, her brow furrowed as if I'd disrupted something crucial. Sterling poured himself a second cup of coffee and said nothing to me at all. He simply raised his eyebrows in that wordless way he had, the one that made it clear I was an imposition even when I was silent. Theo picked at his toast, avoiding my eyes, and then set his plate aside with a loud scrape. Marielle finally glanced over, her tone so bright it felt brittle. "Mother, would you mind getting us some extra ice from the bar, and maybe a few more napkins? You know how the staff here can be." She smiled as though she'd asked for nothing more than a polite favor. I felt my hand tighten around my cup. My voice wouldn't come, so I nodded and pushed back my chair. As I stood, Theo muttered, "Grandma should just wear an apron if she wants to help so much." Sterling laughed, and that was somehow worse than any words he could have said. I walked to the lobby on legs that didn't feel steady, past the same clerk who had pretended not to see me the day before. He kept his gaze fixed on the screen as I passed. For a moment, I thought I might keep walking straight out the front doors into the rain and never look back. But instead, I turned the corner and found the small alcove with the bench Warren had built, the one spot in this place that still felt like mine. I sat there until the tremor in my hands subsided. When I looked up, I saw my reflection in the glass. My face was lined and tired, but my eyes were clear. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was love or family. It was something else entirely. I returned to my room, shutting the door behind me with a soft click that sounded final. My heart was still hammering, though the rest of me felt oddly calm. I sat on the edge of the bed and reached for my suitcase, unzipping the lining to pull out the wooden box I had kept hidden for years. My hands didn't shake this time. They moved with purpose as I set the box in my lap and lifted the lid. Inside, the papers were neatly arranged, just as I'd left them. Original deeds with my name in looping ink, the incorporation documents Warren and I had signed together, the letters from our attorney confirming my majority stake in the Rosewood Hotel. I traced my finger over the embossed seals, remembering how proud Warren had been to see our names printed alongside the property's official records. I had kept them safe all this time, not because I thought I would ever have to prove anything, but because it felt like the last piece of our life that hadn't been contaminated by disappointment. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Rowan Glass's number. My thumb hovered for just a breath before I pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. "Mrs. Velman?" Rowan's voice was warm, and hearing it steadied me further. "It's been a while." "It has," I said. "I think it's time I made some updates." He was quiet for a beat, then spoke carefully. "You mean the will?" "Yes, and I want the hotel management to be notified today." I heard the scratch of his pen moving across a notepad. "I can draw up revised documents. Who are you removing?" "My daughter and her husband," I said without hesitation. "They will not inherit anything. I'd like to establish a trust for my grandson. He will receive it only if he proves he can treat me with respect." Rowan didn't question me. He simply said, "Understood," and promised to prepare everything immediately. When I hung up, the silence in the room felt different, less like defeat and more like relief. I closed the wooden box and placed it on the nightstand where anyone could see it if they cared to look. Later that afternoon, I asked the front desk to call Mr. Sloan, the general manager. He arrived at my door within minutes, polite curiosity in his eyes. When he stepped inside, I motioned for him to sit across from me at the small writing desk. I didn't bother offering pleasantries. I set the folder of documents between us, flipped open to the page with my signature, and waited for him to read. His eyebrows lifted as he skimmed the lines. Then he looked up with a respect I hadn't seen in anyone's face for a long time. "Mrs. Velman," he said quietly, "I had no idea you were staying here this week." "That was deliberate," I replied, "but I won't remain invisible any longer." He nodded once, a precise movement that told me he understood exactly what I was asking without further explanation. "How would you like us to proceed?" "I'd like you to formally notify the guests in Suite 2011 that their accommodations are being changed," I said. My voice was steady. "Inform them that their conduct violates our standards. Offer them the standard suite instead." "And if they object?" he asked. I folded my hands on the desk. "You may remind them that I am the majority owner and that my decision is final." When he left, I felt a strange weight slide off my shoulders. For so long, I'd been carrying the burden of pretending I had no power, no claim to anything except what they decided to spare me. I sat for a while listening to the rain tap against the glass, and when I finally stood to look out over the courtyard, I felt almost light. That evening, as I ate alone in the restaurant, I watched Mr. Sloan approach their table with two bellmen trailing behind him. Sterling's face turned a furious shade of red as Marielle tried to sputter a protest. From my seat near the window, I lifted my glass of water and tipped it in their direction. I had almost finished my meal when the knock came at my door. I didn't hurry to answer. I took the time to fold my napkin, rinse my teacup in the sink, and smooth my hair. When I opened the door, Marielle stood there, her cheeks blotched red and her eyes shining with indignation. Sterling hovered just behind her, jaw clenched so tightly the vein at his temple pulsed. "Mother," Marielle began, her voice trembling, "what in God's name are you doing?" I stepped aside, motioning them in. I wanted no audience in the hallway. They moved stiffly past me, and I closed the door with a deliberate softness that made them both flinch. I didn't sit. I stayed standing, the folder of documents already resting on the dresser, waiting like a silent witness. "You humiliated us," Marielle hissed, arms crossing tight over her chest. "In front of everyone. Do you have any idea how that looked?" "Yes," I said. "I have every idea." Sterling took a step forward. "You don't have the authority to—" I held up one hand, and to my surprise, he stopped mid-sentence. "I do," I said evenly. "I've always had it. You simply never thought to ask." Marielle swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this? We're family." I studied her face, searching for even a flicker of regret that wasn't tangled up in embarrassment. I didn't find it. "Because you decided long ago that I wasn't," I told her. "You decided I was only useful when I was silent." She started to cry then, soft, wet sounds that might once have made me reach out to comfort her, but I only watched. "I've updated my will," I continued. "You will inherit nothing. Sterling, you will never again step foot in any property that bears my name." Sterling's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked as if he'd been struck. I felt no triumph, only clarity. Marielle wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And Theo," she whispered. I let out a long breath. "He will have his chance, but he'll have to earn it." I turned to the window so I wouldn't have to watch them leave, and when the door finally clicked shut behind them, I felt the hush of the room settle like a promise. It was nearly noon the next day when there was another knock, this one softer. I opened the door to find Theo standing there alone, his hair rumpled and eyes rimmed pink. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clutching the sleeves of his sweatshirt in both hands. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking, "about what I said, about laughing." I felt something loosen in my chest. I stepped aside so he could come in, and he did, sitting on the edge of the bed like he was afraid it might swallow him whole. I pulled the chair from the corner and sat across from him. Up close, I could see how much he still looked like Marielle at that age, before time and resentment hardened her into someone I hardly recognized. "I know you're angry," he said quietly. "Dad says you're trying to punish us." I folded my hands in my lap. "No, I'm trying to tell the truth. It's different." He nodded, though I wasn't sure he understood yet. He looked down at the carpet. "Mom said you didn't want me to have anything." "That isn't true," I told him. "There's a trust being created for you, but it's only yours if you can grow up to be the kind of man who treats people with respect." He blinked fast, absorbing it. "I don't care about money," he whispered. "I just don't want you to leave." I felt a sharp ache, then something I hadn't let myself feel for years. "If you ever want to visit me because you care," I said, "my door will always be open." He stood and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. I closed my eyes and held him for a long moment. When he stepped back, his face was solemn but steady. I watched him walk down the hall, and when the quiet returned, it felt gentler than before. 2 mornings later, I packed my suitcase for the last time. The documents had all been signed, the trust established, and the hotel's management transition completed. Mr. Sloan had come personally to thank me for the years of quiet stewardship, and I had thanked him in return for seeing me, even when others chose not to. I walked through the lobby without lowering my gaze, feeling the weight of each step, but no longer ashamed of it. At the front desk, the same young clerk stood ramrod straight, his face pale as I approached. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, but I lifted a hand before he could speak. I wasn't interested in rehashing old humiliations. Instead, I gave him a small nod, and the relief that washed over his features was almost touching. He handed me my final receipt without a word. Outside, a car idled in the drive. The driver stepped out to help me with my bags, but I waved him off and carried them myself. It felt important to leave this place on my own power. As I settled into the back seat, I looked up at the sign above the doors. Rosewood carved in gold letters that would always belong to Warren and me, no matter who held the keys. I rested my hand over the folder on my lap, the one containing every last proof of what I'd built. Not for validation, not for revenge, though both had their place, but because the truth had never stopped mattering, even when I'd tried to pretend otherwise. The driver asked where I was headed, and I told him the airport. I watched the hotel shrink in the rear window, the rain sweeping across the roofline, and felt the last pieces of bitterness slide away. It was only a building, after all, but it was also the story of my life. And I was finally ready to write the next chapter somewhere new. As we reached the edge of the highway, the clouds began to break apart, thin ribbons of pale light spilling over the ocean. I leaned closer to the window, watching the horizon blur between gray and gold. Somewhere out there, the sea still carried the same rhythm Warren and I had listened to all those years ago when the world felt possible. For the first time in a long while, I smiled, the kind that starts small and honest. I thought of how proud he would have been to see me take back what we had built, to see me remembered, not as a burden, but as the woman who refused to disappear. The car turned north, the rain finally slowing to a mist. I closed my eyes and whispered his name, letting it drift like a prayer between the sound of the waves and the hum of the tires. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the lighthouse still stood, its beams sweeping across the endless water. I imagined it catching the edge of the car's window, a flicker of light tracing a path ahead. This time I didn't look back.